pulling the dial around to the finger stop each time.
When you grew up poor in the 1970s, even the smallest things carried the heavy weight of sacrifice, survival, and silent pride. How did everyday objects become the quiet witnesses to a generation's hardest lessons? And why did we forget what they meant? Hand-me-down everything was not just a fact of life, it was a badge of survival. Clothes came from older brothers, cousins, neighbors, or even church donations. You might recognize a jacket in a school photo 2 years before you ever wore it. Patches covered knees and elbows like battle scars, and sometimes shoes came pre-worn with someone else's story stamped into the soles. Toys had scratches and missing parts, but that never slowed the adventures. Even bicycles were handed down, often with fresh duct tape on the seat and maybe a new coat of spray paint to call it yours. Furniture followed the same path. A sagging couch from a great aunt. A dresser missing a drawer that you learned to work around. Nothing ever matched, but everything had a story, and that gave it value. Families stitched together homes from layers of old love, even if the springs poked you at night and the jacket sleeves were a little too short. Growing up this way taught you not just thrift, but gratitude. And speaking of the walls that held all those memories together, nothing said making do louder, or more colorfully, than the next design trend. Wood paneling and linoleum floors made every modest 1970s home feel like a time capsule. Paneling covered living rooms, basements, dens, sometimes even kitchens. It came in thick, heavy sheets with fake grain that glowed a deep, unnatural brown under fluorescent light. Linoleum ruled the floors, often in dizzying patterns of harvest gold, avocado green, or rusty orange. Cold in winter, sticky in summer, but easy to sweep clean with a broom worn down to the nubs. The walls and floors might have clashed wildly, but nobody cared. You were lucky to have them. Rugs were hand-me-downs or garage sale finds, layered over worn patches. Furniture scraped against paneling with every move, leaving scratches no one bothered to buff out. And every step across the floor squeaked or creaked like the house itself was sighing. There was no money for trendy makeovers, just pride in keeping everything neat and clean. Families gathered around battered coffee tables, resting drinks on crocheted doilies while dreams of wall-to-wall carpet and real wood floors lived quietly in the background. And while the floors might have been tired, the phone situation had its own tangled kind of charm. Rotary phones with long cords were the lifelines of every house, and also the biggest source of frustration. Mounted on the kitchen wall or sitting heavy on a tiny side table, the family phone was public property. You dialed one number at a time, dragging the wheel back with a whir that felt like an eternity. If you messed up a single digit, you had to start over, breathing curses under your breath. Long conversations meant dragging the extra long, curly cord around a corner or down a hallway, desperately trying to get a little privacy while the cord stretched tighter and tighter, like a snake ready to snap. Parents yelled if you tied up the line too long, and heaven help you if someone needed to make a call while you were still whispering about crushes or weekend plans. Twisting that cord into knots while you talked was practically a nervous habit, and when it cracked or frayed, you kept using it anyway, careful not to get shocked. The whole house lived by that ringing bell. And just like the phone cord, even the simplest parts of home life were stretched, stitched, and sewn into something lasting, especially the ones that kept you warm at night. Homemade curtains and bedspreads were stitched from pure necessity and a lot of leftover fabric. Grandmothers, mothers, and aunts became master tailors without formal training, turning discount bin cloth into something beautiful enough to hang across the windows or drape across the bed. Old jeans, flour sacks, and bargain basement bolts of polyester found new life stitched together in wild combinations of paisleys, stripes, and polka dots. If a curtain shrank or faded unevenly, no problem. You hemmed it shorter or just turned it upside down. Bedspreads were thick quilts or layered afghans, often pieced together by hand, each patch telling a quiet story of another hard year. Every stitch carried the stubbornness of people who refused to let lack of money define their homes. These homemade touches brought color and warmth to rooms where the wallpaper might peel and the windows might rattle in the winter wind. They made simple places feel special. And while a fancy, store-bought set was a distant dream for many, the love and effort sewn into every scrap made a different kind of richness. But when the summer sun turned those patched-together houses into ovens, the real struggle came from the one thing no amount of sewing could fix. No air conditioning, just box fans, and if you were lucky, a couple of them. Those big, square fans were shoved into windows, perched precariously on dressers, or dragged room to room with extension cords that should have been condemned. The air was hot, dusty, and barely moving, but you stood in front of the fan anyway, letting it blast your sweaty face with something that sort of resembled a breeze. Sleeping meant peeling yourself off sticky sheets in the middle of the night and flipping the pillow to the cool side over and over. Families ate dinner with every window open, flies buzzing in the curtains, and wet washcloths draped around their necks. Popsicles melted faster than you could eat them. Every so often you stood in front of the fan and talked into it, cracking yourself up with the robotic voice it created. Air conditioning was something you heard rich people had. The rest of the world survived summer one box fan at a time, half praying for a thunderstorm to break the heat. And if you thought those sweaty afternoons were tough, the kitchen pantry was stocked with survival food that proved just how resourceful people had to be. Government cheese and powdered milk were more than just ingredients, they were lifelines. Distributed through assistance programs, these staples arrived in plain packaging that said everything and nothing at all. The cheese came in a cardboard box, dense and oddly shiny, requiring a serrated knife and some upper body strength just to slice. It melted into casseroles, glued sandwiches together, and reappeared night after night in slightly different forms. Powdered milk came in big cans or packets, mixed with cold water and a little hope. It never fooled anyone, especially kids who grew up with the clumps and that unmistakable aftertaste. But it made cereal possible. It kept mac and cheese creamy, and it stretched the grocery budget further than most imagined. These foods were badges of resilience, never fancy but always reliable. Families learned to make do, to get creative, and to never waste a drop, and when payday came, maybe there was enough left over for something special, a slice of meat, even if it came from a can. Spam, bologna, and Vienna sausages were pantry royalty when meat was too expensive to buy fresh. Spam came in that little blue can, slid out with a suction sound, and landed on the plate with a jiggle. Fried in a skillet or slapped onto white bread with mustard, it was salty, filling, and weirdly satisfying. Bologna was the default lunch meat, sliced thick or thin, eaten cold or pan-fried until it curled like a hat. Sometimes it had a red rind you had to peel off like a wrapper on a candy bar you were not thrilled to eat. Vienna sausages were tiny and packed in mystery juice, but they were soft, ready to eat, and shelf-stable, which meant they showed up in lunch boxes and emergency meals alike. These meats were flexible, filling, and most importantly, cheap. They were stacked in kitchen cupboards, sold in bulk, and used until the last can was scraped clean. They fed kids before school, filled sandwiches at lunch, and anchored dinners that otherwise might not have happened. And when the food was heavy and salty, you needed something sweet and cold to wash it down, preferably bright, artificial, and stirred with a spoon. Tang and KoolAid were childhood in a pitcher. Tang claimed to be the drink of astronauts, but for most kids, it was the drink of summers and empty fridges. Powdered orange magic scooped into a cloudy pitcher, stirred with tap water and a long spoon, transforming a mundane afternoon into something special. KoolAid came in little paper packets. Just add sugar, they said. And people did. A lot of sugar. The flavors were wild, the colors even wilder. Electric red, bright purple, neon blue, and even the occasional mystery mix that seemed to change flavor with each sip. It stained your tongue, your shirt, and your soul, becoming a badge of honor for any kid who had dared to indulge. You drank it from jelly jars, plastic tumblers, or whatever cups had not disappeared in the yard, each sip a reminder of carefree days. It was cheap, it was cold, and it made every cookout, backyard game, and neighborhood water fight just a little sweeter. Adults drank it too, even if they pretended not to, sneaking sips when they thought no one was looking. It was the taste of not being thirsty anymore, of making do with what you had. And when the fridge was half empty and the pantry held only odds and ends, that pitcher stood tall in the center of the table as a beacon of creativity. It was a drink that sparked creativity, inspiring kids to concoct their own flavors, mixing in fruit or even a splash of soda for fizz. With Tang, every day felt like a new adventure, a reminder that even the simplest things could bring joy. Then came the art of making meals from whatever was left. One pot, one pan, and a whole lot of improvisation. Casseroles made from leftovers were not about recipes. They were about resourcefulness, a way to weave together the threads of the week's meals into a tapestry of flavor. One scoop of rice, a handful of frozen peas, 2 slices of yesterday's meatloaf, and a can of cream of whatever soup. Dinner. The casserole dish was a blank canvas, and moms knew how to make the paint stretch, turning scraps into comfort. Leftovers were not tossed. They were layered, mixed, baked, and topped with a sprinkle of breadcrumbs or cheese if you had it, creating a patchwork of flavors that was both familiar and new. Tuna casserole, potato surprise, and hamburger hash were all different names for the same idea. Do not waste a thing. These meals bubbled in the oven, made the house smell warm and inviting, and fed everyone without complaints. Usually. Kids might poke at the mystery bits, ask what that brown thing was, or try to trade plates for something they deemed more appealing. But they ate it, because food was food, and if it came hot and with a side of bread, even better. And speaking of bread, when you could not afford bakery prices, the next option was homemade, and it tasted like comfort, filling the air with the promise of nourishment. Homemade bread and biscuits were not luxuries. They were weekend rituals that brought families together in the kitchen. Flour, lard, and a pinch of salt turned into something hearty and satisfying, the very essence of home. Bread dough rose slowly in a greased bowl, covered with a dish towel that smelled like laundry soap and kitchen memories, a comforting aroma that lingered long after the baking had finished. Biscuits came together in a flurry of hands, rolled out on floured tables cut with drinking glasses and baked until golden, the anticipation buzzing in the air. They were served with everything: peanut butter, jelly, gravy, stew, or just butter if you were lucky enough to have some, each bite a taste of love and labor. The house filled with warmth that money could not buy, and laughter danced around every corner. Even kids who did not care for chores would hover near the oven, waiting for the first steamy bite, eyes wide with expectation. No one talked about artisanal baking back then. It was just survival, turned delicious, a testament to creativity born of necessity. And if you had a little leftover dough, you fried it into makeshift donuts, the smell of them sizzling in hot oil wafting through the air, and tossed them in sugar. Simple. Perfect. Gone in minutes, leaving behind only sweet memories. And once dinner was done and the dishes were stacked, everyone would gather around a screen that was small, stubborn, and very, very black and white. The flickering images bringing the family together in a shared experience that was just as cherished as the meals they had created together. Black and white televisions with rabbit ears were more than entertainment. They were tests of patience and teamwork. You had maybe 3 channels if you were lucky, and each one came with its own fuzzy personality. The television itself was a piece of furniture, usually perched on a wooden stand or built right into a cabinet. You would twist the knob slowly, praying the picture would hold, but it rarely did. So up went the aluminum foil. Someone stood beside the screen, adjusting the rabbit ears like a human antenna, frozen in position because, somehow, that exact angle brought in a clear image. A foot to the left? Static. Someone walking past? Complete chaos. You might catch a whole episode of The Andy Griffith Show if everyone stayed still and quiet like monks. It made every good picture feel like a triumph. And when programming went off air at midnight, the national anthem played, followed by a long hiss of static. No rewinds, no streaming, just quiet. And for families without a television or looking for something free and more reliable, there was another sacred space that welcomed everyone without asking for a dime. Public libraries were more than quiet rooms with books. They were entire worlds for families who could not afford movie tickets or new toys. Inside those walls, time slowed down. You could spend a whole Saturday flipping through comic books, running your fingers along spines of hardback mysteries, or quietly giggling at Mad Libs in the corner. The smell of old paper and floor polish was oddly comforting. Libraries had everything: encyclopedias for school reports, microfilm machines for curious dads, and an entire children's section with beanbags and story hour. Sometimes there were film strips or grainy educational reels projected on pull-down screens, free cinema before streaming existed. And it was not just for kids. Parents checked out cookbooks, how-to guides, and entire armloads of novels. The librarians knew your name. The overdue fines were gentle. The card catalog was a puzzle, and finding a new favorite book felt like a treasure hunt. It was quiet joy. And when you brought those books home, the next step was gathering around the table, with snacks, laughter, and just enough sibling rivalry to make it interesting. Board games and card nights turned every kitchen table into a battlefield. Monopoly could last hours or end in tears by the second round. Uno was not just a game, it was a weapon when someone dropped a draw 4. Go Fish, Crazy Eights, and Old Maid taught kids strategy, bluffing, and how to accuse someone of cheating without getting grounded. Adults played rummy or poker with worn-out decks that had been around since the Johnson administration. The rules were flexible. The scorekeeping was suspect, but the laughs were real. You would use coins as chips, bottle caps as tokens, or torn notebook pages as scorecards. And sometimes the prize was nothing more than bragging rights and the last piece of dessert. These nights were cheap, cozy, and competitive. They brought everyone together, even if they ended with someone flipping the board. And after the game was packed up and everyone was still buzzing, the fun did not end. It just moved outside. Outdoor play until the street lights came on was not just a pastime, it was a way of life. Kids dashed out the door after school with no plan, no phone, and no supervision, just a half-flattened ball and a whole neighborhood of adventure. Games of tag stretched across lawns, hopscotch chalked up every sidewalk, and makeshift bases turned empty lots into ballparks. Someone's bike became a getaway vehicle. Someone's backyard became a fort. You learned to climb fences, bandage scraped knees with spit and leaves, and negotiate playground politics without a referee. Parents called out from porches when dinner was ready, or when thunder rolled in. And the rule was always the same: be home when the streetlights flickered on. It was freedom wrapped in sweat, grass stains, and imagination. There was no agenda, just movement and mischief. And if a toy broke, no one cried. You made another one. DIY toys and crafts were not Pinterest perfect. They were survival entertainment. A pair of socks became a puppet with a crooked smile and button eyes. 2 tin cans and a long string. A telephone that worked across backyards. Empty cereal boxes turned into dollhouses. Cardboard tubes became rocket ships or binoculars. Kids cut, glued, and taped their way through boredom using whatever was in the junk drawer. Glitter was optional. Ingenuity was required. These toys were not shiny or store-bought, but they were yours, built with your own 2 hands and probably some Elmer's glue. They fell apart, but you fixed them. They were crooked, but they worked. You played for hours without batteries, without screens, without a single instruction manual. It was not about perfection. It was about making something from nothing. And when your jeans tore from all that play, the next solution was not a trip to the mall, but a patch that made the hole into something new. Patchwork jeans and iron-on patches were more than quick fixes. They were childhood badges of honor. Every ripped knee told a story, and every patch was proof that money did not grow on trees. Moms kept drawers full of leftover fabric, and dads knew how to run an iron for one reason only: getting that patch to stick. Whether it was a rainbow on one leg or a cartoon character poorly aligned on the other, the result was always uniquely yours. These jeans were never new, never perfect, and never bought full price. They had been handed down, repaired, and outlived multiple growth spurts. Sometimes the patches were purely practical, just there to stop the cold breeze from hitting skin. Other times, they were worn like decoration, turning wear and tear into something creative. You learned to crouch carefully, to slide on the carpet without peeling off the corner of your latest repair. They crinkled in the dryer, peeled at the edges, and smelled faintly like glue. But they worked. And when October rolled around, those same scraps of fabric turned into something magical. If you were willing to get creative with your costume. Homemade Halloween costumes were stitched from resourcefulness and imagination, not store aisles. You were not a licensed character. You were a ghost made from a cut-up bedsheet, a robot with cardboard box armor, or a witch wearing mom's old black skirt and a borrowed scarf. No one had plastic masks with rubber bands that snapped by the third house. You used eyeliner as face paint and tinfoil as accessories. There were no fancy materials or elaborate props, just a living room full of newspaper, glue, and last-minute decisions. Costumes were built the night before, often with the help of an older sibling and a lot of optimism. But the magic was in the effort. Everyone looked a little mismatched, a little lopsided, but you wore it with pride. Neighbors still gave you candy. Friends still knew what you were supposed to be. And most importantly, your parents did not spend a single extra dollar. That spirit of self-reliance started early and extended far beyond October, because many of those same families kept one important machine humming year-round to make sure every outfit survived one more season. Sewing machines were not hobbies, they were lifelines. Tucked in corners of kitchens or folded into tables with squeaky hinges, these machines were used daily, not occasionally. Every household had someone who could sew, a mom, a grandma, even an older sibling trained in the art of making do. Buttons were replaced before anyone noticed they were gone. Hemlines were adjusted to follow growth spurts. And fabric scraps were turned into everything from aprons to doll clothes. The sound of the machine, clack, 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 followed by a proud sigh, was as familiar as the smell of dinner cooking. Patterns were reused until the paper tore. Spools of thread lived in cookie tins, and pin cushions shaped like tomatoes sat on every sewing table. A ripped seam did not mean shopping. It meant 15 minutes with a sewing machine and maybe a few choice words under your breath. Clothes were personalized, mended, and loved into longevity. But when winter came, it was not just clothing that was stitched with care. It was the cozy things that made a cold morning feel a little less harsh. Hand-knitted scarves and hats were not just for warmth. They were for love. Grandma's hands made them by memory, row by row, each stitch whispering patience and protection. Your scarf might not match your coat, your hat might itch a little, but they worked. They were gifts made of time, not money. Bright colors, clashing patterns, maybe a pom-pom or two, they stood out on the schoolyard, but no one cared. Every kid had one, and every family had at least one person who knew how to knit. Yarn was bought on sale or scavenged from old sweaters, unraveled and reborn into something new. These items were often oversized and rarely symmetrical, but they were durable, washable, and stitched with warmth long before they ever saw a cold day. And if you forgot yours at school, you got the talk. These items were precious. And when it rained, there was only one way to keep the hairdo safe without sacrificing dignity or frugality. Plastic rain bonnets were the unsung heroes of every purse and coat pocket. They folded like origami and smelled like vinyl, always ready for a sudden downpour. Moms pulled them out with the flair of a magician, unfolding the crinkly plastic into a perfectly triangular shield that tied under the chin like a grandmother's battle helmet. Hair stayed dry. Curls stayed set. Makeup stayed intact. These bonnets were not fashionable, but they were effective. They snapped in place like armor and came off just as quickly, folding back into their original size and disappearing into a handbag or glove compartment. Everyone had one, even if they swore they did not. And though they were worn with a hint of embarrassment, they were also a symbol of practicality, a rainy day defense that cost nothing and saved everything. They were often adorned with bright colors, each unique shade reflecting the personality of the wearer, even if it was hidden under layers of raincoats and umbrellas. The The sound of raindrops hitting the plastic created a symphony of reassurance, a reminder that no matter how sudden the storm, they were prepared. And speaking of saving, the next big cost saver did not come from fashion, but from fuel. Carpooling and shared rides turned every back seat into a rolling neighborhood. Gasoline was not cheap, paychecks were thin, and families squeezed every mile out of every gallon by riding together wherever they could. Moms in station wagons mapped out morning routes like military strategy: 3 kids to elementary school, 2 more to high school, 1 dad to the factory gate. Sunday meant cramming cousins into faded vinyl seats for the trip to church, everyone dressed in hand-me-down suits that wrinkled before the first hymn. Windows fogged with chatter, lunchboxes clattered under footwells, and the radio fought static while news crackled through tinny speakers. Carpooling built friendships and tested patience. If someone overslept, the whole schedule slid sideways. Yet people trusted one another, knowing that next week the roles might reverse. Small talk filled the gaps between stops. Secrets were whispered, and new jokes were born in those cramped rows. Every screech of brakes and every shared laugh was a thread woven into the rich tapestry of community. When a parent saved enough fuel money for 1 extra grocery trip, it felt like winning the lottery. Carpooling was thrift turned into community on wheels, and when no ride was available at all, the answer was even simpler. You used your own 2 feet. Walking or biking everywhere stitched entire towns together. Sidewalks were highways for sneakers, and rust-spotted bicycles became passports to freedom. Kids pedaled to school with backpacks flapping like flags behind them, the thrill of independence radiating from their grins. Parents hoofed it to corner stores for a loaf of bread or the evening newspaper, sharing nods with neighbors we rarely greet today. Rain meant rubber boots splashing through puddles. Snow meant scarves pulled tight and crunchy footsteps on iced pavements. Shoes wore thin, chains squeaked, but no one complained. Distance measured by determination instead of odometer. A battered Schwinn could haul groceries in a front basket or pull a wagon of soda bottles to the redemption center for a handful of coin. You learned shortcuts through alleys, memorized every cracked curb, and built calf muscles that felt like steel. Each journey was an adventure, the world unfolding in vibrant detail with every turn. And when the journey stretched beyond walking distance, another option awaited, one that jingled in pockets and clicked through turnstiles like tiny brass promises. Public transportation tokens were golden discs of possibility. Buses hissed to the curb, doors folding open with a sigh, and riders dropped a token into the fare box, a bright clink that meant movement. Subways rumbled beneath city streets, their stations perfumed with newsprint and electricity. Kids clutching school projects sat beside suited workers, all united by that simple coin. Tokens were allowance currency, chore rewards, and emergency backups tucked in sock drawers. They bought independence, a ride to the library, the doctor, or a far-off cousin's birthday party. Conductors punched transfers with rhythmic snaps, and route maps became treasure hunts for the quickest path home. The anticipation of arriving at a new destination filled the air with excitement, blending with the scent of fresh coffee from nearby cafes. When prices rose, households counted tokens like ration stamps, deciding which trips mattered most. Even lost in couch cushions, a single token felt valuable, salvation for the next rainy day commute. Eventually, magnetic cards replaced metal, but the memory lingers. 1 coin, 1 ride, endless stories of laughter, mishaps, and shared experiences. And when a family finally scraped together enough to buy wheels of their own, affordability came with a different learning curve, found right beneath the gear shift. Used cars with manual transmissions were rites of passage, not luxuries. Dad scanned classified ads printed on gray newsprint, searching for something cheap that still had good bones. A test drive meant grinding gears down back roads while hoping the muffler held on. Stick shifts taught patience. Stall the engine at a stoplight and hear horns blare like angry geese. Interiors smelled of old vinyl, sun-baked dust, and maybe a forgotten fast food wrapper from the last owner. Windows cranked by hand, radios carried more static than song, and floorboards sometimes revealed the rushing asphalt below. But monthly payments were low, insurance was cheaper, and do-it-yourself repairs felt within reach. Families named these cars Rusty, Betsy, Old Blue, and celebrated every extra mile squeezed out of balding tires. Kids learned fractions by reading dipsticks and adjusting tire pressure. Yet owning such a car came with an unspoken agreement. When something broke, you did not head straight to a mechanic. You rolled up your sleeves because the driveway was about to become a garage. Do-it-yourself car repairs turned driveways into mechanical classrooms and every busted part into a pop quiz you had better pass. The hood lifted like a stage curtain, revealing belts, hoses, and mysteries you were expected to solve with determination and a socket set inherited from Grandpa. Saturday mornings began with the scrape of a jack on concrete and the hiss of an air hose borrowed from the neighbor. Coffee steamed on the porch rail while someone crawled under the chassis, flashlight clamped between teeth, muttering a running commentary of every rusted bolt in sight. Kids became tool runners, learning the difference between a half-inch and 9/16 before they knew long division. Grease smeared foreheads like war paint, and every skinned knuckle was a badge of persistence. Manuals the thickness of phone books lay open on greasy fenders, pages dog-eared to sections titled Timing Chain Replacement or Carburetor Rebuild. Victory arrived in small bursts, a stubborn spark plug finally loosening with a satisfying snap, a fresh gasket seated without a leak, an engine sputtering back to life after hours of trial and error. Failure meant another trip to the salvage yard, pockets full of hope and exact change for whatever part could be salvaged. But even setbacks bonded families together under the open hood, laughter echoing each time the engine roared instead of coughed. Fixing the car was frugality, dignity, and family time rolled into one, proof you could keep moving forward even when the odometer and the odds said you should have stopped miles ago. The thermostat in a 70s house wasn't just a dial, it was a line in the sand. Parents treated it like a sacred relic, never to be touched without permission or a written declaration of frostbite. You'd be freezing, fingers like popsicles, and Mom would say, "Put on a sweater," then a second sweater, then a blanket, then maybe sit under the dog. Turning on the heat was seen as weak, wasteful, or wildly indulgent. Some families taped a note over the thermostat, "Do not touch unless you're paying the bill." That thing could be in the dead center of the wall, glowing orange with temptation, and no one dared twist it. Space heaters? Risky. They blew fuses or caught socks on fire. Electric blankets? A luxury item only Grandpa had, and he kept it locked in the closet. You'd go to bed in socks, sweats, and a hoodie, buried under 5 layers like you were camping in the Arctic. Quilts were piled on like sandbags, and your breath made little clouds in the morning. But no one ever turned the heat up, not unless company was coming over or someone got the flu. Even then, it was only for an hour. And while your toes might have been numb, your shoes weren't much better, especially when they had their own built-in air conditioning. Playgrounds used to be a little more dangerous, and the metal slide on asphalt was the crown jewel of poor design. In the 1970s, nearly every school or park had one. It stood tall, often 2 stories high, baking in the sun until it could sear the back of your legs. No shade, no padding, just you, gravity, and a prayer. The steps up were made of thin metal bars. The top had no real guardrails, and when you slid down, you hit that blacktop like a dropped steak. But we lined up for it anyway, over and over. There was something thrilling about the danger. It was a rite of passage, a fast, hot, jolting ride that ended in a dusty scrape or bruised elbow. Teachers watched from afar. Parents shrugged. Kids were expected to bounce back. If you made it to the bottom without a scream, you earned bragging rights. If you got burned, you wore it like a badge. Safety standards have come a long way since then, but so much of that fearless, feral childhood play was tied to moments like these. Today, it is hard to believe we once thought that was normal, but deep down, part of us misses it. Shared bedrooms among siblings meant privacy was a myth and bedtime was an adventure. 2, sometimes 3 kids in one room, bunk beds, fold-out couches, mattresses on the floor. You learned to sleep through snoring, giggling, and whispered arguments over who stole the blanket. One lamp lit the room. One drawer held everyone's socks. If you wanted quiet, you closed your eyes and hoped for sleep. But there was love there too. Late-night stories, secret jokes, a flashlight under the covers. You made forts out of sheets and built walls with pillows, pretending they were rooms of your own. You learned to share without thinking, to wait your turn, to keep secrets. Sure, you fought. You drew invisible lines down the mattress. But you also looked out for each other, listened when someone cried, celebrated the nights when no one got in trouble. Those cramped quarters built closeness you never asked for, but maybe needed. And years later, you remembered those rooms not for the lack of space, but for the way they held you together. Shared bedrooms were loud, messy, and full of life. And even now, you sometimes miss what it meant to fall asleep beside someone who knew you by heart. Wearing patches on clothes was less about style and more about grit. Holes in the knees, sewn shut with denim cut from old jeans, elbows wearing thin, covered in colorful scraps stitched with uneven lines and quiet determination. Every patch was a story, a game of tag gone too far, a tumble off a bike, a season of growth that stretched fabric past its limit. You did not throw things out, you fixed them. Because replacing a pair of pants was not always an option. Your mom had a sewing kit in an old cookie tin, filled with thread that never matched and buttons that had seen better days. She worked at the kitchen table, bent over your clothes like a surgeon, making something broken last just a little longer. You might have felt embarrassed. You might have tugged your sleeves to hide the stitching. But those patches were love in disguise. They meant someone cared enough to keep you dressed, even if the clothes were tired. They meant you kept going. Sometimes those patches were loud. Bright fabric that clashed with the shirt, a cartoon print stitched onto plain denim, whatever scrap was closest to the sewing basket. And sometimes they were nearly invisible, matched carefully to hide what had torn. Either way, you knew where they were. You could trace each one with your fingers. They scratched a little when new. They softened over time. On cold mornings, you sat still while your mom pinned a square over a frayed spot, asking you to hold your arms up or turn around so she could get it right. It was uncomfortable, but it meant you were cared for. No one wasted thread on clothes they did not plan to keep, and no one stayed up late mending knees if they did not believe you were worth the effort. Some patches covered wear and tear, others covered stains you could never quite get out. But all of them did the same thing. They gave your clothes a second life, and in the process, they gave you a quiet kind of dignity. You might not have had new clothes, but you had something better. Clothes that were saved, like you, again and again. And in a world where appearances mattered too much, patches were the proof that making do was still doing enough. You were worn, but you were whole. Dinner was whatever came out of a can, and some nights felt like a roulette wheel of aluminum survival. Spin the pantry shelf and land on creamed corn, canned ravioli, maybe some mystery meat labeled beef product in gravy? You didn't complain. You grabbed the can opener, dumped it into a pot, and called it a meal. Vienna sausages? Delicacy? SpaghettiOs? Main course? Canned green beans boiled to mush? A vegetable side, technically. And if you were really lucky, there'd be a can of fruit cocktail for dessert, half syrup, 2 grapes, and 1 suspicious cherry. These meals were quick, cheap, and shelf-stable. They didn't taste great, but they were filling. Kind of. Most nights you'd just douse everything in that watery ketchup and call it a win. And if you ran out of everything, you found another harshest R can. Because when money was tight, you ate what you had. But even after dinner, the reminder of frugal living was waiting in the bathroom. Scratchy, see-through, and utterly unavoidable. Before Bluetooth speakers and streaming playlists, there was the FisherPrice record player, and it was a masterpiece of childhood simplicity. You wound it up with a chunky white knob and placed a thick plastic disc on the turntable. It clicked into place, and when the needle dropped, the magic began. Out came twinkly, music box-style versions of nursery rhymes, folk songs, and lullabies. The songs were short, cheerful, and unforgettable. The discs were colorful and clunky, with molded ridges that somehow produced melodies. It did not matter if the sound was a little warped or off-key. You were in control. You had your own music machine. For many kids, this was their first experience playing music, and the pride that came with it was unmatched. You could stack your favorite discs. You could play the same one on repeat until it drove your parents up the wall. And the best part? No batteries. Just your hands, your ears, and your imagination. You did not need to understand how it worked. You just needed to hear that familiar click, feel the turn of the crank, and know that something sweet was about to happen. It was low-tech joy in a beige plastic box, and it never stopped playing in our heads. Furniture from thrift stores or curbside finds gave homes that mismatched charm only necessity could create. A sagging couch from someone else's garage sale. A wobbly coffee table rescued from the sidewalk. Chairs with mismatched legs or beds with slats that creaked under every turn. This was what made a living room feel lived in. There was no delivery truck, just a neighbor with a pickup, or a slow push down the block with a dolly borrowed from Uncle Joe. You sprayed it down, you wiped it twice, and you made it yours. Some pieces were covered in throws to hide the rips. Others leaned against the wall to stay upright. But they had character, stories, a past you never asked about. In kitchens, the table might have a burn mark or a dent from years of use, but it still held dinner. In bedrooms, dressers groaned when you pulled the drawers, but they closed eventually. New furniture was for people with money. For everyone else, you took what you could get, and you were thankful for it. Because when money was tight, having something, anything, to sit on was a win. You did not care how it looked. You cared that it worked. The kitchen of the 1970s did not just serve food, it made a statement. And that statement was harvest gold and avocado green. These two colors dominated every American kitchen appliance. Your refrigerator, your stove, even your blender wore these colors like a uniform. It was not just paint, it was identity. These colors were supposed to represent nature, health, and a touch of luxury. Harvest gold had a warm golden glow that felt like sunlight. Avocado green was earthy and bold, a perfect match for the indoor plant movement and natural fiber craze of the time. But somewhere along the way, the trend turned into a punchline. Yet, for those who lived it, there is no forgetting. You remember the heavy click of the fridge door, the way the green surface reflected your face in the oven window, the hum of the blender making root beer floats. These were not sleek or modern. They were sturdy, reliable, and filled with the smells of Sunday dinners and burnt toast. Maybe you were not fond of these colors as a kid. Maybe you even hated them. But when you see them now, something deep inside stirs. They are more than colors. They are the palette of your childhood. You saved the wrapping paper. Every birthday, Christmas, or baby shower came with an unspoken rule. Open carefully. No wild tearing, no ripping down the middle, just slow peeling at the tape and strategic folding like you were handling ancient scrolls. Moms would hover with a watchful eye and swoop in the moment you had the paper halfway off, flattening it onto her lap like she was pressing fresh laundry. Some pieces had names already written on the inside flap from last year. That didn't matter. Flip it over, fold it up, stash it in the kitchen drawer next to the scissors, masking tape, and twist ties. When Christmas rolled around again, the same crinkled snowmen and faded Santas made their encore. Some people ironed it, others stacked it in boxes marked nice ones and everyday birthdays. It wasn't just paper, it was policy. You grew up thinking this was normal until you visited a friend's house and watched them shred through a gift like it was nothing. It felt criminal. But paper was money, and so was space. Which is why sometimes two kids shared one twin-sized bed and everyone just made it work. Heating only one room in winter was not just a strategy, it was survival. The whole house might be freezing, but one space stayed warm. Maybe it was the living room with a kerosene heater. Maybe the kitchen with the oven door cracked open. You brought in extra blankets. You wore your coat indoors. Everyone piled in, like penguins sharing body heat. You did homework at the coffee table, ate soup from mismatched bowls, slept on the couch or a pile of comforters laid out on the floor. The hallway felt like Antarctica. The bathroom? A short, icy sprint. At night, the cold crept into your bones, but during the day, you all huddled in that one room like it was the center of the universe. Parents told kids to keep the door shut, do not let the heat out. No one dared argue. It was about bills, about making it to spring. And even though it felt unfair at the time, it also brought people close. Literally, you learned to share space, to pass the time, to be warm in more ways than one. Heating one room was not ideal, but it was home, and somehow it got you through. A metal television antenna with pliers as the remote was peak 70s innovation, because when the knob broke, and it always broke, no one ran to the store. You just grabbed whatever tool was nearby and made it work. Those bulky televisions were furniture, literal wood-paneled tanks. Changing the channel involved standing up, twisting a dial that clicked through 3 fuzzy stations, and praying the vertical hold didn't freak out. When the knob snapped off, you didn't replace it. You jammed in a pair of pliers, vice grips, or even a fork. Sometimes it was taped up with masking tape or rubber bands for extra grip, like some post-apocalyptic control lever. Getting the channel just right took surgeon-level precision and patience. You'd lean in, turn slowly, hear that satisfying clunk clunk, and hope it landed on the right UHF miracle. If someone walked too close to the antenna, the screen would go berserk, so you'd angle it just right and bark, "No one move!" Until The Price is Right came in clear enough to see Bob Barker's microphone. Some households had elaborate antenna balancing rituals. One leg up, arm outstretched, holding a metal spoon while standing near the window. Others just wrapped the whole thing in aluminum foil and hoped for the best. Television time wasn't about ease. It was about negotiation, shared suffering, and creative problem solving. And speaking of creative, dinner time had its own government-issued solution. Homemade school lunches in washed-out containers were the unofficial lunchbox of every frugal family. Forget the cartoon thermos or the shiny metal lunch pail. If you were poor in the 1980s, your sandwich came wrapped in wax paper and packed in an empty margarine tub. Maybe the lid said country crock, but inside was leftover spaghetti or peanut butter crackers. You used the same container every day. The label peeled, the edges warped, but it worked. Your drink? Not a juice box, maybe a reused jelly jar with watered-down KoolAid. You prayed it did not leak. In the lunchroom, you sat next to kids with perfectly packed snacks, cheese sticks, pudding cups, chips with real logos. You ate quietly, or fast, or not at all. But at home, it made sense. Those containers stacked neatly in the cupboard. Your parents washed them each night and packed them again with care. It was not about shame. It was about stretching every cent. And even though you knew it was different, you also knew it was made with effort, maybe even love. Those stained lids and handwritten notes stuffed under the sandwich were signs of sacrifice. And now, all grown up, they feel like something you miss. No-name brand cereal in a baggie was breakfast for those of us living on the edge of the food pyramid. You didn't find it in the cereal aisle's middle section. You crouched down, way down to the bottom shelf and grabbed that crinkly plastic sack filled with sad, dusty flakes or weird puffed things that kinda looked like Fruit Loops but tasted like cardboard hope. No mascot. No prize inside. Just a white label that said Toasted O's or Sweetened Corn Crunch, like it was trying to convince itself it was worth eating. You poured it into your bowl. It made a sound like packing peanuts, and then you hit it with that pitcher of powdered milk and watched it all turn soggy in under 30 seconds. No snap, no crackle, barely a pop. But it was cheap, real cheap. Mom could buy a sack the size of a small dog for less than half the price of the name brand. And if you complained, you were told to sprinkle a little sugar on top and be grateful. That cereal may not have been fun, but it filled you up. And speaking of things that didn't fit quite right, your next outfit probably had a long family history. Before you could run to the freezer aisle for a rainbow box of treats, there was Mom's kitchen. And in that kitchen were Tupperware popsicle molds, pastel-colored, slightly sticky, and always in the bottom drawer. You filled them with orange juice, KoolAid, or whatever soda was left over. Then you popped on the plastic stick tops, placed them in the freezer, and waited. The waiting was the hardest part. You checked every 10 minutes, you tapped the sides, you asked Mom if they were ready yet. And finally, when they were frozen solid, you ran to the counter and twisted. Sometimes they slid right out. Sometimes you had to run them under warm water for what felt like forever. But the result was always worth it. Homemade popsicles, cold, sweet, and uneven. One might be syrupy, another mostly ice. You never knew, but it was yours. Made by you. That tiny sense of accomplishment melted faster than the treat itself. Sticky fingers, drips down your arm. A moment of pride on a hot afternoon. Tupperware popsicle molds were not flashy, but they were practical, nostalgic, and endlessly fun. Long before popsicles came in plastic wrappers with cartoon mascots, this was the taste of summer at home. Limited or no air conditioning meant summer nights were a battle with the heat. The box fan sat in the window, humming like a tired engine, barely moving the thick air. You sweated through your sheets, drank warm water, slept with the lights off and the windows wide open, hoping for a breeze that never came. Some homes had one window unit, and it stayed in the living room. Everyone gathered there like refugees from the sun. No one moved. The couch was soaked in humidity. Tempers flared, ice trays emptied fast. You wore as little as possible, stuck your head in the fridge, and counted the hours until dark. At school, kids talked about central air. You could not imagine it. The idea of a whole house being cool felt like science fiction. You made popsicles out of juice in ice cube trays. You wrapped wet washcloths around your neck. You laid on the floor, hoping the tile was cooler than the bed. And through it all, you survived. Uncomfortable, sticky, and half asleep, but alive. No air conditioning was not ideal, but it made you tough, and it taught you how to endure heat, not just in your house, but in life. Hand-me-downs from cousins you didn't even like were a rite of passage, wrapped in a garbage bag and smelling faintly like someone else's attic. You never asked for them. You never wanted them. But every few months, your mom would show up with a stack of perfectly good clothes that had survived multiple siblings and were now headed straight for your closet. The shirts had pilling. The jeans had weird stains. The shoes were 2 sizes off but still got shoved onto your feet with the lie, "They'll stretch." Sometimes they were cool. Most times, not even close. Your new winter coat had 3 previous owners and a name written inside the collar that wasn't yours. You didn't get to complain. You were told to smile and say thank you when your aunt handed them over with pride. Kids at school might notice. You learned to deflect, to joke, or just to keep your head down. But deep inside, you dreamed of clothes with actual tags and no suspicious armpit wear. And just when you wanted to disappear into the couch had plans of its own. Shrinky dinks were magic in plastic form. You started with a sheet, clear, flexible, and begging to be colored. You grabbed your markers, drew a wild design, cut it out with safety scissors, and popped it in the oven. What came out was a tiny, hardened version of your masterpiece, often warped but always perfect. Watching it shrink behind the oven door was part of the thrill. You would kneel on the floor, peering through the glass, and gasp as your drawing curled, twisted, and finally flattened. Kids made keychains, jewelry, ornaments. Whatever their imagination allowed, it felt like crafting with sorcery. One minute, you were tracing cartoons or making friendship tags. The next, you held a miniaturized relic in your palm. The smell of melting plastic filled the kitchen. Parents worried, but no one stopped us. Shrinky dinks were affordable, creative, and wildly popular at every sleepover and birthday party. You could even buy branded kits, superheroes, cartoon characters, holiday themes. But the best ones were always your originals. There was something deeply satisfying about seeing your art transformed like that. Tiny, tough, and totally unique. We never questioned the process. We just knew it felt like creating something real, something small that still felt huge. Using public transportation exclusively meant your life moved on someone else's schedule. There was no jumping in the car for milk, no last-minute rides. You waited. at bus stops, on corners, in the rain, in the cold, in your Sunday best or your work shoes. The bus was never early. Sometimes it was late. But you waited. You held a pocket full of exact change. Maybe a transfer stub. You knew the routes like the back of your hand. You sat near the front if you were tired. In the back if you did not want to talk. You watched strangers argue, laugh, cry. You saw your city from a different view, block by block, stop by stop. Owning a car seemed like another world. Gas, insurance, repairs. Those were luxuries. The bus was what you had. And it was enough. Sort of. It got you to school, to work, to church. You learned to carry groceries in bags that would not break. You made friends with the drivers. You memorized delays. And when the ride was over, you stepped off into whatever came next. Public transportation did not just move you. It taught you patience, resilience, and how to hold on when the brakes hit hard. The ice cream was just ice milk, and that difference hit hard after the first spoonful. It looked like the real thing. It sat in the freezer next to the real thing. But the second you tasted it, you knew. This was a frozen letdown. Ice milk was thinner, sadder, and melted into a puddle before you could even finish your bowl. It had the texture of cold foam and the flavor of diluted disappointment. You'd dig in, hoping for creamy indulgence, and instead get something that tasted like sweetened air. It lacked richness, it lacked joy, and yet it was what you had. You weren't about to complain out loud. Ice milk was treat enough, especially when it was scooped into old mugs or reused butter tubs. Some families added a splash of chocolate syrup to mask the flavor. Others stirred it into a milkshake just to make it tolerable. You weren't allowed to waste it either. You ate it, smiled politely, and maybe sprinkled crushed crackers or sad sprinkles on top to make it festive. No fudge, no cherries, just a frozen lie. Still, it was dessert. And you learned to appreciate it, or at least pretend to. Because the only thing worse than no dessert was no ketchup. And the next fix required some serious commitment. Before microwaves took over the world, there was Jiffypop. That iconic silver foil pan with the wire handle looked more like a science experiment than a snack. You placed it over the burner, turned the heat to medium, and waited. First, nothing. Then a rustle. Then a pop. Then a full-on explosion of sound as the silver dome started to rise. It puffed up like magic, growing rounder and louder until it looked like a shiny balloon about to burst. You shook the handle gently, trying not to burn the bottom. The anticipation was everything. Kids gathered around the stove like it was a campfire. Parents pretended not to worry it might go up in flames. And then it was done. You tore open the top and reached inside, burning your fingers on the edge, of course, for a handful of hot, buttery popcorn. It did not matter if half of it was burnt and the other half still kernels. It was the experience, the ritual. The popcorn was secondary. The fun was in the show. Jiffypop was not just a snack. It was a performance. And if you ever had a movie night that started with that sizzling silver pan, you remember the thrill of the balloon. Ice cubes were once a challenge, not a luxury. If you grew up with metal ice cube trays, frequent moves or housing instability meant you never got too comfortable. Just when you started to settle in, the boxes came back out. New schools, new streets, a different room, if you had one at all. Sometimes you moved in the middle of the night, sometimes with a borrowed truck. You left friends behind, teachers, pets even. You learned how to pack fast, how to blend in, how to stay quiet and observe before speaking. Rent went up, jobs disappeared. Family members moved, and you moved with them. You slept on floors, couches, sometimes in motels. Home was a loose term, more about who was there than what it looked like. At school, you kept your head down. You did not decorate your locker, you stopped memorizing addresses, and when someone asked where you were from, you paused, because there was no short answer. But through it all, you kept going. You adapted. You figured out how to rebuild again and again. And every time you unpacked that last box, even if it was just for a few months, you called it home. because you had to, because that is how you survived. Share the memory that struck you hardest in the comments, press like if you felt it too, and subscribe for more walks down the roads we thought we had left behind.